God, the fundamental capacity to perceive and identify. In the beginning, there was just capacity. The capacity to sense, to perceive, to focus, to experience. As the capacity to perceive develops in recognizing specific patterns and distinguishing them from each other, specific patterns of sounds are noticed. At first, these patterns of sound are just distinct patterns of sound. Distinct patterns of sound. Later, the particular patterns of sounds can be associated with particular other sensations or experiences, such as certain sights, or certain smells, or certain tastes of different kinds of food, smells of flour, right? Of a certain kind of plant, such as flour. Certain sights, certain different colors, red, blue, pink. If you look around now, you might see there's many different colors that you can see. If you're in a room that has light in it and your eyes are open, you can probably see a variety of different colors. The capacity to see is fundamental to the actual seeing of any particular specific pattern, say, of color. So those patterns of sound, just as patterns of sight or anything else, those patterns of sound are called names or labels. They're specific to sound, however, as distinct from sights. Labels and names are sounds. So there's lots of different kinds of sounds. I can make the sound ch 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 ch. That's not a name. It's not a label. It's just a sound. But if I go chair, that's a label. That's a name of something. It's a word. It's not just a sound. Chair is a sound, but it's not just a sound. It's also a symbolic linguistic unit called a label or a word or a name. So the mere perceiving of labels still is not language. Chair isn't, it's not the full extent, at least, of the possibility of language. To just have a label for something, it's actually, it's not human, uniquely human language. We have other animals that use signal sounds, even clapping their hands, or making sound of a beaver beating its tail down on the ground to make a really loud alert sound. Well, those are signal sounds. You can make signal sounds with drums, but those aren't words. They're not language. But when you take a group of sounds that are words and put them together in a particular order, where that order is meaningful, that's language. You have grammar, syntax. It's not important to know all these different terminologies, but in the written blog here, I don't really distinguish quite what is meant by the fact that the mere perceiving of the mere perceiving of labels is not language. It's just the perceiving of labels. Color, red, blue, whatever. Those are just labels. Language itself is much more intricate. This is like the difference between a 1-year-old speaking and an 8-year-old speaking. Huge difference. The 1-year-old has words, but they don't have language. Not in the sense that I'm using the word language. So, I'm going to return to reading now. When the perceiving of words is present, the perceiving itself may have no name or label. The what that is doing the perceiving may not be named or labeled. However, the perceiving of words can perceive a labeling of that perceiving, which is called identity. What is doing the perceiving? That's the identity. We could say who is doing the perceiving, which is a who is a subcategory of what? It has to be a thing before it can be a who, right? An identity before it can be a someone or person. A labeling of identity is a distinct naming or labeling from the labeling of relational experience, which is like seeing some visual pattern. The interaction between the capacity to perceive visually, for instance, and some stimuli which may be labeled what is perceived. That out there is black, and that out there is white, and that out there is red. But the identity isn't itself red. It has no color. It isn't even really meaningful to call it colorless, because it's just beyond the whole spectrum of colors. Colors have nothing to do with the identity of the process of perceiving. The activity of perceiving isn't red, it's not blue, it's not green, it's not colorful or colorless. Colors can be experienced by that capacity to perceive color, for instance. So the labeling of identity allows for the linguistic construction such as what is perceived by me, the identity, the capacity to perceive. And this, I don't even know if you would call this philosophy. It's certainly, nothing I've said so far would probably be identified as religion or spirituality. Is it philosophy? No, I'm just like basic recognition of how language works. If you want to call it philosophy or anything else, that's a whole other separate label to put over it. This is just how it is. It's just one model of recognizing how language operates. So let's review. First, arises the capacity to perceive. And you can think of all this in the sequence of like neurological development of an infant or any other creature or organism. First arises the capacity to perceive. Then the process of perceiving various patterns. We distinguish sight from sound. We distinguish blue from red. We may not have names for blue to distinguish it from red, but we can tell the difference between blue and red. We just don't know what to call them initially. So at that stage, then we have the distinguishing and naming of some of the perceived patterns. They got consistent labels. We start to call blue blue every time we see blue, and red we call red every time we see red. And you are around a little kid, and that's what they do. They go around and they demonstrate and practice. It's just spontaneous. Red. Oh, there's a red balloon. Oh, there's a red shirt. They're practicing the word red, and they're just like going crazy about red. And then later somebody's going crazy or really active in distinguishing arrogance from pride or whatever. They're just whatever somebody's like really focused on learning and developing in that distinction. That's what they go around recognizing and labeling and identifying. They're just a little machine of identifying red and identifying blue and distinguishing between them, or identifying arrogance and identifying pride and distinguishing between the two. By the way, consider that pride and arrogance are extremely different. I used to think of pride and arrogance as almost synonymous terms. Then I recognized pride has to do with a sense of security and recognition, and arrogance has to do with a sense of competitiveness and comparison and putting someone else down and elevating one's own perception, not out of pride, but out of fear. That's something that I might go around, or anyone might go around, sorting arrogance from pride, good from evil, red from blue, girl from boy. doggy from kitty. These are just things that humans might do. First degree misdemeanor from fourth degree misdemeanor. We just go around sorting and categorizing and classifying. So, as we go around, first arises the capacity to perceive, then the process of perceiving various patterns, and then the distinguishing and naming of some of these perceived patterns, and then the naming of the capacity to perceive and name patterns, which can be labeled my identity. That's me, that's I. I am the capacity to perceive and name various patterns. I go around and I sort things and I label them and I identify them and I interpret. And I could be, I could use some language unprecisely. I don't even know if unprecisely is a word, but I can just make up words and other people can understand what I mean, even though I made up a word. It's not even a word anybody's ever heard, but somebody can recognize from the root and the prefix. I put it together and they understand the root word and the prefix on it, and unprecisely makes sense to them. Unprecisely is the opposite of precisely, generally speaking. So now, here's my identity. I'm not a red something. I'm not a old something. I'm actually not new or old. I'm the perceiving that's happening now. I'm an eternal something. That doesn't mean I can't use a term like I'm this many years old in reference to a body. That's totally normal and valid and common. But the process of perceiving, when I say I, my identity, I don't need the identity itself isn't 6 foot tall. The identity is the process of perceiving. The identity doesn't have a height. We may say it has a central location. We can geographically say, here's where I am in terms of my individual consciousness, where my focus is, where my perceiving is. So here is the arising of the experience of an identity, a presence, and then I can focus this identity. This identity can focus around a particular pattern of words as the specific identity, not just the itself, but the specific
identity. The specific identifying, such as I am this particular body with one particular name for me. That's my name. All the other names are the things that I name other things. I'm not those things. I'm not a red chair. I perceive the red chair. I am whatever my name is. And from this particular place or geographic identity or geographic label, geographic name, this place, which could be my room or my city or my country or whatever place, from this particular place, that's where I'm from. That's where I am. I'm from here. I'm from Earth. I'm from this solar system. I'm from the Milky Way. And this particular identity I can refer to with certain particular qualities and roles and rights and duties. Here are the languages that I speak. Here's the schools that I've attended or that I'm attending. I'm arrogant or I'm proud or I'm not arrogant and I'm not proud. All the denials and all the assertions and affirmations, declarations, all of those are things that I do. But none of them are the identity. That's just the identifying by the identity. So the identity arises in language. At least the identifying arises in language.
the capacity for language is fundamental to any linguistic identifying. Before an identity is the capacity to identify in language. There's no fundamental identity. There's only a fundamental capacity. The capacity for identifying allows for the identifying of specific identities, such as that sound, or chair, that word, or chartreuse, this color, or champion, that one, or this person, Chuck. There's no fundamental isolation between capacity and identity. That's just a linguistic isolating. There's capacity. Capacity does identifying of identities. Identifying identities is one possible activity of capacity. And the linguistic metaphors of many ancient traditions, called religions, could be called philosophies, whatever, the identifying of identities is compared to the branchings of a tree, as in the various vines of a single vine. Like you have a web, and then you have the different lines of the web. You have a vine and the different vines of that vine, or branches of that vine. A tree has various twigs and branches and leaves, but all of its tree. So the capacity to isolate or divide a variety of identities through linguistic labeling, the capacity to isolate or divide a variety of identities through linguistic labeling, like red and blue, like left and right, like trunk and twig and roots and leaf. That capacity is the branching of capacity, as in the activity of the tree of capacity. In other words, the isolating or dividing of identifyings is the branching of capacity. It's the branching of linguistic labeling. Look, not me out there, me over here. The capacity for language is fundamental to all activities in language, of language, through language, all linguistic patterning, all focusing through language, all creating through language, all constructing through language, in language, of language, by language. The capacity for the linguistic and identifying of identity is fundamental to all linguistic identifying of identity. Before there can be the presence of an instance of perceiving, there must be the presence of the capacity to perceive. One form of perceiving is the linguistic identifying of identity. So before there can be the presence of an instance of the linguistic identifying of identity, there must be the presence of the capacity for perceiving the presence of the linguistic identifying of identity. There's I, and then what I am, and how I am, and who I am, and all these stories and specificities that the capacity to identify can put on top of any particular identity. The linguistic labeling of the presence of that capacity has included labels such as Atma, Mahatma, Brahman, Jehovah, Yahweh, God, Allah, and divinity. These words are just words. Which one of those words are not words? They're all just words. Before those words were created, and before language was created, there was already the capacity to create words, out of which those words were created, and the capacity to experience language, out of which those linguistic processes were experienced, and are experienced every time that they're experienced, like right now. What is present now is prior or more fundamental to those words and to language. That fundamental capacity, this fundamental capacity, is earlier than any of those particular words or the languages in which those words arise. Again, Sanskrit or Hebrew or Latin or English or Arabic, whatever. All of those languages are branches of a single tree, metaphorically speaking. All of those words, and all words, are branches of the tree of language, or twigs or leaves or whatever, of the tree of language. The entire tree is the capacity for language, but that capacity for language is just one kind of capacity. There's the capacity for sensation, sights, sounds. Language is just a specific subcategory related to the perceiving of sound. Before there was any perceiving of sound, there was the presence that is present now. Before there was any identifying of a word, any word, God, pumpkin, chair, there was the presence that is present now. Before there was any identifying of a group of words as a language, like the Hebrew language or the Latin language or the English language, there was the presence that is present now. A language did not create this presence. A word did not create this presence. A sound did not create this presence. This presence perceived sounds and perceives sounds right now. This presence is eternal. This presence perceived words and perceives words right now as specific kinds of sounds, as distinct from ch-ch-ch and certain sounds are perceived as words. This presence, which is eternal, meaning now, can perceive words. This presence can perceive languages and differentiate between one language and another, potentially. It might be able to understand some language other than English. Assalamu alaikum. Namaste. Hey, how you doing today? All these different languages can be perceived by the capacity to perceive language, to perceive words, to perceive sounds. So the capacity, this presence, it's eternal. It's fundamental. It's like, you could say, the root or the trunk of the tree from which all these language activities arise. This presence may also recognize that the perceiving of sounds and of words and language only arises through this presence, from this presence, as the activities of this presence, as the branchings of this presence, as the creations of this presence, the linguistic identifyings of this presence. Sounds and words and languages and identities are all the activities of this presence. This presence makes sounds. Every sound you hear is the sound of this presence. If you can hear a computer's fan humming, that's the sound of this presence. Who's making the sound? The computer fan humming? This presence. Who's making the sounds of this voice? This presence. The same presence that hears is the presence that also makes the sounds. Have you ever noticed your heart beating? You weren't really doing it, but you notice it beating. Maybe your stomach gurgles and you think, I didn't make that sound. Well, okay. Maybe you hear someone else's stomach gurgling and you think, I didn't make that sound. I didn't mean to do that. No, you don't even think that. But it's this presence that makes the gurgling sounds of every stomach. This presence makes every stomach. And this presence is also the only one who can perceive stomachs and gurgling and languages and linguistic identifying. So without this presence, this eternal presence, there's no identifying in language. There's no language. There's no words, there's no sounds, and no capacity to perceive sound or anything else. Only through this presence there is the capacity to perceive. Then the perceiving of sounds and sights and other sensations. Then the perceiving of words or labels or names for the perceivings of sounds and sights and other sensations. Then the perceiving of language is the process of labeling and naming and identifying and interpreting and claiming and authoring and creating. And the perceiving of the presence that is fundamental to all branches of linguistic activity. You have to perceive after perceiving language and the operation of language, one begins to notice the operation of language is not isolated to a particular individual, right? A particular identity. Language is operating through lots and lots of human organisms. Once the operating of language through lots and lots of human organisms is perceived, then the perceiving of the presence that's fundamental to all branchings of linguistic activity might be perceived. There's no linguistic activity without this fundamental presence, without me. I'm not just a branch. I'm not just an identity. The branch is just an identifying in language, but I'm not just an identifying in language. I'm that which identifies in language. I'm the presence of the identifying of linguistic identities. Before Bodhidharma was, I am. Before Muhammad was, I am. Before Jesus was, I am. Before Buddha was, I am. Before Isaiah was, I am. Before Moses was, I am. Before Abraham was, I am. Before Adam was, I am. The eternal presence is fundamental. All of the identifyings in language arise through the activity of the eternal presence. That's here, now, always, already, still. When my prophets speak, that's my speaking. My prophets recognize that it is my speaking when they speak, that it is me speaking through that particular instrument or linguistic identity. My other instruments, or my other agents, or my other branches are also only able to speak through me. And indeed, they only live through me as well. But they may not perceive me. They may not know me. They may not even use my name or any of my names. They could be 2 months old human infant. That's still my instrument, my agent, my branch. When it begins to speak, that's my speaking. When it begins to perceive sounds, that's my perceiving of sounds. They may not know me. Even though they may use my name, whether or not they use my name. They may not know me until they perceive this presence, this me, not the conventional me, but the divine identity, the divine presence, the divine me. And in their lack of recognition, whether they're a 2-month-old human or whatever else, they're completely innocent of their sinning. It's sinning not to recognize the unity and universality of the fundamental presence. But all of it's kind of like a 2-month-old doesn't speak a particular language fluently. Okay, they're innocent. They just don't have those distinctions in language. They don't have those perceptions. We don't criticize, well, we could, but it would be a little odd to criticize a bud that it isn't already a flower, or a seed that it isn't already a full-grown tree. So, some of my instruments, they don't recognize me. They claim to have their own will and their own intention, as if it's isolated from mine and in competition with other people, other spirits, the devil, God. God hasn't listened to me. God isn't answering my prayers. They can say things like that, but that's still me speaking. They're innocent of their speaking, all of their activities, all of their sinning, just as a hand is innocent of where the arm moves it, and the finger is innocent of where the muscles move the bones of the finger. It's all one process. To focus on, oh, it's the it's the 13th branch on that tree that produced the flower. No. Sure, fine. But the whole tree produced the branch and the flower. Uh-oh. A little background noise interrupting. When the earth produces the flower off of a tree, when the sun produces flowering off a tree, that's just that activity.